Winston S. Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 4, Chapter 12, The Russian Civil War. During the year 1919 there was fought over the whole of Russia a strange war. A war in areas so vast that considerable armies indeed of hundreds of thousands of men, were lost, dispersed, melted, evaporated. A war in which there were no real battles, only raids and affrays and massacres, as the result of which countries as large as England or France changed hands to and fro. A war of flags on the map, of picket lines, of cavalry screens advancing or receding by hundreds of miles without solid cause or durable consequence. A war with little valor and no mercy. Whoever could advance found it easy to continue. Whoever was forced to retire found it difficult to stop. On paper it looked like the Great War on the Western and Eastern fronts. In fact, it was only its ghost, a thin, cold, insubstantial conflict in the realms of dis. Kolchak first and then Denikin advanced in what were called offensives over enormous territories. As they advanced, they spread their lines ever wider and ever thinner. It seemed that they would go on till they had scarcely one man to the mile. When the moment came, the Bolsheviks, lying in the center, equally feeble, but at any rate tending willy-nilly constantly towards compression, gave a prick or a punch at this point or that. Thereupon the balloon burst, and all the flags moved back, and the cities changed hands and found it convenient to change opinions, and horrible vengeances were wreaked on helpless people, vengeances perseveringly paid over months of fine-spun inquisition. Mighty natural or strategic barriers, like the line of the Volga River or the line of the Ural Mountains, were found to be no resting places. No strategic consequences followed from their loss or gain. A war of few casualties and outnumbered executions. The tragedy of each Russian city, of loyal families, of countless humble households, might fill libraries of dreary volumes. But the population of Russia is a village population. The peasant millions dwell in scores of thousands of villages. There was always the land. The nature brought forth her fruits. What was the life of these villages in this period? Savinkov gave a convincing account of it when he lunched together one day with Lloyd George. It was in some ways the story of the Indian villages over whose heads the waves of conquest swept and recoiled in bygone ages. They had the land. They had murdered or chased away its former owners. The village society had flowed over into new and well-cultivated fields. They now had these long-coveted domains for themselves. No more landlords, no more rent. The earth and its fullness, no more, no less. They did not yet understand that under communism they would have a new landlord, the Soviet state, a landlord who would demand a higher rent to feed his hungry cities. A collective landlord who could not be killed, but who could and would, without compunction, kill them. Meanwhile they were self-supporting. Their root existence could be maintained apart altogether from the outer world or modern apparatus. From the skin of beasts they made garments and footwear. The bees gave them honey in place of sugar. They gave them also wax for such lights as might be needed after sundown. There was bread, there was meat, there were roots. They ate and drank and squatted on the land, not for them the causes of man. Communism, Tsarism, the World Revolution, Holy Russia, empire or proletariat, civilization or barbarism, tyranny or freedom, these were all the same to them in theory, but also, whoever won, much the same in fact. There they were, and there they stayed, and with hard toil there they gained their daily bread. One morning arrives a Cossack patrol. "Christ is risen, the Allies are advancing, Russia is saved, you are free. The Soviet is no more." And the peasants grunted, and duly elected their council of elders, and the Cossack patrol rode off, taking with it what it might require up to the limit of what it could carry. On an afternoon a few weeks later, or it may be a few days later, arrived a Bolshevik in a battered motor car with half a dozen gunmen, also saying, "You are free, your chains are broken, Christ is a fraud, religion is the opiate of democracy. Brothers, comrades, rejoice for the great days that have dawned." And the peasants grunted, and the Bolshevik said, "Away with this council of elders, exploiters of the poor, the base tools of reaction. Elect in their place your village Soviet, henceforward the sickle and hammer of your proletarian rights." So the peasants swept away the council of elders and re-elected, with rude ceremony, the village Soviet. But they chose exactly the same people who had hitherto formed the council of elders, and the land also remained in their possession. And presently the Bolshevik and his gunmen got their motor car to start and throbbed off into the distance, or perhaps into the Cossack patrol. Moscow held the controls of Russia, and when the cause of the Allies burned itself out in victory, there were no other controls. Just chatter and slaughter on a background of Robinson Crusoe toil. The ancient capital lay at the center of a web of railroads radiating to every point of the compass. And in the midst a spider. Vain hope to crush the spider by the advance of lines of encircling flies. Still I suppose that 20 or 30,000 resolute, comprehending, well-armed Europeans could, without any serious difficulty or loss, have made their way very swiftly along any of the great railroads which converged on Moscow, and have brought to the hard ordeal of battle any force that stood against them. But 20 or 30,000 resolute men did not exist or could not be brought together. Denikin's forces foraged over enormous areas. They boasted a superficial political sway. They lived on the country and, by so doing, soon alienated the rural population, which at first had welcomed them. Had he collected the necessary supplies at one spot in the south for a direct dash to Moscow, and had he seized the psychological moment just before the Siberian armies began to fade away, he would have had a good chance of success. Master of Moscow and its unequaled railway center, with a corps of trustworthy troops, his power and prestige might have been unshakable. But there never was a thrust. No Napoleon eagle swoop at the mysterious capital, only the long thin lines wending on ever thinner, weaker and more wary. And then finally, when the Bolsheviks in the center of the circle were sufficiently concentrated by the mere fact of retirement, they in their turn advanced and found in front of them nothing but helpless populations and scores of thousands of compromised families and individuals. The fitful and fluid operations of the Russian armies found a counterpart in the policy, or want of policy, of the Allies. Were they at war with Soviet Russia? Certainly not, but they shot Soviet Russians at sight. They stood as invaders on Russian soil. They armed the enemies of the Soviet government. They blockaded its ports and sunk its battleships. They earnestly desired and schemed its downfall. But war? Shocking. Interference? Shame. It was, they repeated, a matter of indifference to them how Russians settled their own internal affairs. They were impartial. Bang, and then, at the same time, parley and try to trade. The reader might well have supposed that the decision of the Big Five to support Kolchak, which was finally taken in June, marked the end of doubt and vacillation. They could send no troops, they could not spend much money, but they could give a steady aid in surplus munitions, in moral countenance, and in concerted diplomacy. Had they acted together simply and sincerely within these limits, they might have reached a good result. But their decisions to support Kolchak and later to support Denikin represented only half a mind. The other half had always been, and was throughout the summer of 1919, uncertain of itself, skeptical about the prospect of the anti-Bolsheviks, ill-informed about the true nature of the Soviet government and the Third International, and anxious to see whether the extremists in Moscow would not respond to the exercise of reason and patience. A draft memorandum of Lord Curzon's, dated August 16, 1919, describes in severe terms the weakness and confusion of Allied proceedings. It cannot be said that an altogether consistent policy had been pursued. Even now the principles upon which that policy rests in the last resort are in some respects in dispute. Action is taken sometimes by the representatives of the Allied and associated governments sitting in Paris or by the institutions which they have set up, sometimes by the governments themselves. The situation is so complex and the difficulties of arriving at a decision which is acceptable to all are so great that, in some instances, it would be no exaggeration to admit that there is no policy at all. In these circumstances, the great powers, when they met, and too often it must be confessed that refuge is taken in inaction, adopt an uncertain line of conduct. The financial burden tends to fall almost exclusively on the shoulders of those who either have the greatest capacity or the least unwillingness to pay. The independent states or groups of communities, with the fortunes of which we have associated ourselves, do not always make the best use of the help which they get, and are constantly clamoring for more. It remains a matter of almost weekly disputation whether recognition shall or shall not be extended to this or that community. Allied missions, dispatched in every direction, endeavor to produce something like order out of the prevailing chaos. Advice is accepted where it is supplemented by substantial material assistance. Elsewhere it is apt to be ignored. On the western Russian front, Poland and the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia are conducting military operations against the Russian Soviet government. So far as the Baltic states are concerned, continuance of their resistance depends largely on the amount of material assistance which they may be able to obtain, as well as upon the attitude which the Allied governments may decide to adopt in regard to their national aspirations. Political, the present situation is in the highest degree unsatisfactory. His Majesty's government have recognized the de facto authority of the provisional governments of Estonia and Latvia, established at Reval and Libau, respectively, and the Allied representatives in Paris have, in the fifth condition attached to the recognition of Admiral Kolchak, laid down that if a solution of the relations between Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and the Caucasian and Transcaspian territories and Russia is not speedily reached by agreement, the settlement will be made in consultation and cooperation with the League of Nations, and that, until such settlement is made, the government of Russia agrees to recognize these territories as autonomous and to confirm the relations which may exist between their de facto governments and the Allied and associated governments. Yet no further steps have been taken to endeavor to secure the cooperation of the border states of Russia in the policy laid down by the Allied powers, and no communications have been addressed to the representatives of these states in Paris, in spite of their repeated requests to be informed of the intentions of the Allied governments. Grave dissatisfaction has consequently resulted in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. The lack of a clear and decisive policy has been not less manifest in the dealings with the border states of the Caucasian front. Here, as elsewhere, the policy of the Allied powers has hovered between recognition and polite indifference. All is in a flux and uncertainty. And with the withdrawal of the only Allied forces to the south of the Caucasus, serious disturbances, if not worse, may be expected to ensue. It would perhaps be an unjustifiable deduction from the untoward developments that I have described to argue that they have been mainly due to lack either of political vision or harmony on the part of the Allied and associated powers. But it would not be unfair to attribute the setback in part to the fact that single powers have, to a considerable extent, dissipated on various theaters such resources as they have been in a position to give to the whole, instead of pursuing an organized policy whereby effort could be concentrated and a due coordination established between political, military, and financial measures. Meanwhile, I had a direct and definite duty to perform. Our first object was to withdraw from Archangel and Murmansk without disaster and without dishonor. This was a military and political problem, both difficult and delicate. I gave the following account of it to the House of Commons on July 29, 1919. Before the German resistance was broken and the armistice signed, the winter had settled down on the North Russian coast, and the port of Archangel was icebound, or practically icebound, and our men were forced to spend the whole of the winter in this bleak and gloomy spot in circumstances which caused the greatest anxiety. It was evident that the Bolsheviks, with whom they had been in collision, could, if they chose, have concentrated against this particular sector of the circle by which they were invested, a force of indefinite size, and our men were utterly cut off from the outer world except as far as small parties were concerned. Therefore their position was one of much anxiety. They were men mostly of the C3 class, but they had a fine spirit, and once they were promised that they should be brought home before another winter occurred, they discharged their duty with great determination, and maintained the position against some quite serious attacks, and others which might well have become very serious had they been allowed to proceed, and thus the situation has been maintained throughout this dark period. Not only was there considerable unrest among these troops throughout their imprisonment on this coast during the winter, but also in the exhaustion and prostration of the public mind which followed the triumph in the main struggle. There was the greatest difficulty in sending out any form of relief or assistance to those troops for several months. And again, whatever may be the policy decided upon by the Allies in Paris, our forces in Archangel and Murmansk, which are interdependent, will have to stay there until the summer is far advanced. Since they have got to stay, they must be properly supported. They must be sustained with the reinforcements necessary to their safety, which can reach them within the limit I have described, and must be supplied with everything they may require. It is no use people raising prejudice against these expeditions. Everyone knows why they were sent. They were sent as part of our operations against Germany. That reason has passed away, but the troops sent in obedience to it are still on these wild northern coasts, locked in the depth of winter, and we must neglect nothing required for their safety and well-being. Further, we have incurred heavy commitments towards the people of these districts who have espoused our cause, and to the Russian armies, which were encouraged and called into being largely by the Allies and largely for our own purposes during the period of the German war. It has been the custom in this country to pay particular attention to matters of this kind and always to endeavor, to the very best of our ability, to do our duty by those who have put their trust in us, and who have run into danger in consequence of action which we have advised them to take. In order to secure the safe and respectable withdrawal of the Allied troops from North Russia, it was necessary to reinforce them. All our allies wished to quit this melancholy scene as quickly as possible, and the British being in command and constituting more than half of the expedition, had in practice to bear the responsibility and form the rearguard. The bulk of our own troops were entitled to be brought home and discharged under the terms of our demobilization scheme. It was therefore necessary to raise a special volunteer force to relieve the tired and impatient conscripts and to wind up the affair. On March 4, the War Cabinet decided to press the Allied representatives in Paris to agree to the early evacuation of North Russia by the Allied troops. To prepare for this and to meet the dangerous situation existing at Archangel, the War Cabinet authorized me to make any necessary arrangements. In pursuance of this decision, I therefore raised 2 new brigades, each of 4,000 men, composed of volunteers from the great armies which were demobilizing. The officers and men came forward readily, and in a few days the lists were closed. These fine, war-hardened soldiers rapidly assumed coherent formations. They were dispatched to Archangel as soon as the port was open. We thus had a strong, efficient, and well-equipped force at this most critical point from which everyone else was making haste to flee. These troops had no sooner arrived and relieved the worn-out garrison than a dangerous and widespread mutiny broke out in the friendly Russian force. This treachery was said to be characteristic of the Russians, but the explanation is simple. From the moment when we had been compelled by parliamentary and political pressure to proclaim our intention to withdraw, every friendly Russian knew that he fought under a death sentence, and his safest course was to make terms with his future masters at the expense of his departing allies. This reaction, however unpleasant, was inherent in the wise and indeed inevitable policy of evacuation. The mutinies, except on the Onega sector, which went over bodily to the Bolsheviks, were checked and quelled by the spirited action of a Polish battalion and a company of British infantry. But thenceforward, the 25,000 to 30,000 armed and trained local troops whom the Allies had organized could not be trusted as an aid, and must indeed be reckoned as a peril. Fortunately, veteran volunteers had gone out with this very job clearly explained to them. Totally immune from the general disintegration, but comprehending it, and technically superior in every form of warfare, they occupied the wide, depleted front, gripped the treachery in the rear, and easily smote down the attack in front. We had been bitterly attacked by the socialist and the liberal oppositions, and also in some conservative newspapers, for sending any fresh troops to North Russia, and had we not been deaf to these irresponsible counsels and strong enough to take unpopular action, no fresh troops would have been sent. But for their timely arrival, a general landslide and disaster of a peculiarly shameful character and on a considerable scale would certainly have taken place in July. Behind this tempered shield, the withdrawal of the American, French, Italian, and British conscripts and the removal of masses of stores proceeded rapidly without cessation. This was the first phase of our North Russian operations after the armistice. The second is at once more complicated and more disputable. Again, I cannot improve upon the account I gave to Parliament on July 29. In the first week of March, the War Cabinet decided that Archangel and Murmansk should be evacuated before another winter set in, and they directed the War Office to make arrangements accordingly. But they also prescribed that whatever support, nourishment, succor, reinforcements, or aid might be required, or needed by our troops for their safe extrication from this position should be used and dispatched by the War Office. And further, that due regard should be had to the obligations which we had inevitably contracted with every class of the population of Archangel and Murmansk, and with the local Russian army and local Russian government we had called into being. This decision of policy was communicated to the Russian leaders. On April 30, Admiral Kolchak was informed that all the Allied troops would be withdrawn from North Russia before the next winter, but in the meantime we hoped to make it possible for the North Russian government and the Russian army to stand alone after the Allied troops had left. It will readily be seen that if such a solution could have been reached, if this local government and local army could have maintained itself or joined up with the main anti-Bolshevik Russian army, that would have relieved us of the extremely anxious and painful operation of carrying away a portion of the population and troops who were now there, and affording them asylum and refuge, and of settling a most terrible problem for all those loyal Russians who elected to remain on that shore. Although to us who sit here at home in England it may seem very easy to say, clear out, evacuate, cut the loss, get the troops on board ship and come away, and to arrive at that intellectual decision, yet on the spot, face to face with the people among whom you have been living, with the troops by the side of whom you have been fighting, with the small government which has been created by our insistence, with all the apparatus of a small administration, with all its branches and services. When you get our officers and men involved like that on the spot, it is a matter of very great and painful difficulty to sever the ties and quit the scene. I do not disguise from the House that I had most earnestly hoped and trusted that it would be possible in the course of events for the local North Russian government to have a separate life and existence after our departure. And with the fullest assent of the Cabinet and the government, and acting strictly on the advice of the General Staff, we have been ready to hold out a left hand, as it were, along the Dwina River to Admiral Kolchak, in the hope that he would be able to arrive in this district, and by joining the local Russian forces, stabilize the situation and enable our affairs there to be wound up in a thoroughly satisfactory manner. There was, however, a third phase in the North Russian campaign. When eventually it became certain that the Czech troops had no longer the will, nor Admiral Kolchak the power to form any contact with the North Russian area, the final act of evacuation began. So grave was our apprehension of its difficulty and danger that we decided to send a commander of the highest rank to conduct the operation. On August 4, General Lord Rawlinson, the famous chief of the old Fourth Army, embarked for Archangel. At his disposition were placed 3 additional infantry battalions, 1 marine battalion, 1 machine gun battalion, 2 batteries of artillery, a field company of engineers, and 5 tanks. Powerful naval forces, including monitors, which could ascend the Dwina River, lay at hand with ample shipping. The North Russian government, seeing that our decision was irrevocable, resolved with the assent of a substantial proportion both of their army and their people to continue their resistance to the end. They received imperative orders to this effect from Kolchak. This forlorn hope excited a strong wave of sympathy among the British volunteers, and it was Rawlinson's unpleasant task to repress these chivalrous instincts by a sharp reminder that obedience was the first of military duties. The evacuation was to be covered by a sudden offensive against the enemy. He was to be given a blow so severe that before he could recover, not a British soldier nor a loyal Russian who claimed asylum would remain on shore. This operation, elaborately planned, was carried out under General Ironside's orders by the volunteer brigade of Sadlier Jackson and Russian troops. On August 10, the Bolshevik position astride the Dwina River was attacked. The assault was completely successful. All the objectives were taken, and 6 enemy battalions annihilated. Over 2,000 prisoners, 18 guns, and many machine guns were captured. The advance ended with the occupation of the villages of Pushega and Borok, 20 miles from our original position. One may measure the quality of the Red Army by the fact that our losses did not exceed 120 officers and men. The naval flotilla advancing with the troops mined the river at the furthest point, thus barring it for some time to hostile vessels. The enemy having been temporarily paralyzed, a swift and unmolested withdrawal was made, first to the defenses at Archangel and thence to the ships. Food and arms were left with the Russian General Miller and his troops. 6,500 Russians who elected to go were removed by sea to the liberated Baltic states and South Russia. By September 27, the evacuation of Archangel was completed. That of Murmansk followed on October 12. The withdrawal was carried out practically without loss, and for the moment the loyal Russian forces were left in so favorable a position that they actually assumed an offensive of their own. The total pre- and post-armistice casualties, killed, died, wounded and missing, sustained by the British forces in North Russia from the spring of 1918 to October 1919 were 106 officers and 877 other ranks, including 41 officers and 286 other ranks killed. This successful extrication, first of the Allies and secondly of our own troops and the Russian refugees, was only rendered possible by treating with necessary indifference socialist partisanship, opposition, mischief-making, and newspaper clamor. To the best of their ability, the British had discharged their obligations. Safety was provided for every Russian man, woman, and child who wished to leave. Those who remained to continue the civil war did so of their own free will. Short of remaining there and waging war indefinitely against the Russian Soviet, no better solution was possible. But nevertheless, the sequel was melancholy. In a few weeks, General Miller's resistance was extinguished. The Soviet government re-established its rule on the shores of the White Sea, and mass executions, in one case of 500 officers, quenched the last hope of Russian life and freedom in these regions. I can see now the pale faces and staring eyes of the deputation of townsfolk from Archangel who visited me at the War Office at the end of July 1919 to beg for further British protection, to whom I had to return a dusty answer. All these poor workpeople and shopkeepers were soon to face the firing parties. The responsibility for their fate rests upon the mighty and resplendent nations who had won the war, but left their task unfinished. No sooner had the correspondence between Kolchak and the Big Five terminated satisfactorily on June 12, 1919, than his collapse began. In the early part of June, General Gaida's Northern Army made some slight progress round about Glazov. But this did not disguise from our representative, General Knox, that the situation of Kolchak's forces was very unfavorable. The Siberian Western Army had been heavily defeated at the beginning of May in front of Ufa, and at the end of June the Northern Army was involved in its rout. By the end of the month, therefore, the Western and Northern armies had fallen back over 150 miles to Perm. At the beginning of July, the line here ran approximately as follows: east of Perm, Kunga, Krasnofimsk, Simsk, Stelitimak, Orenburg. During July, the retreat of the Siberian armies continued without interruption. By the end of the month, they had evacuated Ekaterinburg and Chelyabinsk, and had lost the line of the Urals. At the beginning of August, the Supreme Council decided to give no further help to Kolchak, who was evidently fast losing his grip of the situation. General Knox said of the Siberian armies, "The men are listless and slack, and there is no sign of their officers taking them in hand. The men do not want rest, but hard work and discipline. The enemy boasts he is going to Omsk, and at the moment I see nothing to stop him. As it retires, the army melts. The men desert to their villages or to convey their families to safety." The retirement of the Siberian army continued throughout August. At the beginning of September they still had a numerical superiority over the Bolsheviks, but having retired since May, their morale was very bad. Nevertheless, at the beginning of September, General Dietrichs struck back at the enemy and recovered nearly 100 miles. The success was short-lived, and Petropavlovsk was occupied by the Bolsheviks. On October 30, the Southern Army continued to retreat, broke up and ceased to be a factor in the military situation. There was nothing therefore between the Bolsheviks and Omsk, which was evacuated on November 14. The government moved to Irkutsk on November 17. General Gaida attempted a coup d'etat at Vladivostok, which appeared for the moment to galvanize the Irkutsk government into life. Such public opinion as existed in Siberia was, however, becoming increasingly estranged from Kolchak, and Bolshevik propaganda grew daily more seductive. While all this was in progress, I had done my best in pursuance of the decisions of the Supreme Council to guide and encourage Kolchak. On May 28, I had telegraphed to General Knox, telling him to use his influence in order to get the Admiral to accentuate all the broad principles of a constituent assembly and a democratic franchise whose decrees shall settle the future government of Russia. General Knox was instructed to do his utmost to secure compliance by Kolchak with all the conditions prescribed by the Big Four. Knox was to avail himself of the services of Colonel John Ward in every possible way, for no one could express better the feelings of patriotic British Labour men equally opposed to autocracy and anarchy. Advice was accompanied by aid. British ships with stores continued to arrive at Vladivostok up till October 1919, and during that year the total amount supplied or carried in British vessels to the Siberian armies amounted to nearly 100,000 tons of arms, ammunition, equipment and clothing. In pursuance of the undertaking given to Parliament and the declared policy of the Cabinet, Colonel Ward and his Middlesex regiment sailed from Vladivostok for England on September 8, 1919. They were followed by the Hampshires on November 1. Thereafter only the British military mission and the railway mission represented Great Britain in Siberia. The withdrawal of the symbols of Allied and British support and the ceaseless retreat of his forces consummated the ruin of Kolchak. On December 24, a revolution took place at Irkutsk, and on January 4, the Admiral placed himself under Czech protection. But what had happened to the Czechs? We have seen them already in October 1918, varying somewhat in well-doing, and exasperated by White Russian mismanagement. The end of the Great War relaxed the bonds which had made them so serviceable to the Allies. Henceforward, their only and most natural wish was to get back to their homes. The Allied victory had liberated Bohemia. The Czech troops were no longer mutineers, no traitors to the Habsburg Empire. They were the victorious soldiers and pioneers of Czechoslovakia. Home, which might have been forever barred and banned to them, now shone in the lights of freedom and of honor. Very brightly did the beacon gleam to their eyes across the vast snows of Russia. Early in 1919, the Czech Army Corps began to be a source not of help, but of positive danger. The Czechoslovak National Council, which the troops had evolved, was, no doubt with reason, actively critical of the Omsk government. Committees were formed in the regiments, not unlike those which rotted the Russian armies after the revolution. Their discipline and their fighting value deteriorated. In the spring, they were withdrawn from the front and put to guard sections of the railways. In June, it was settled that they should be repatriated as soon as possible, and appropriate steps were taken to this end. On Christmas Eve, Kolchak, still the nominal director of Siberia, was in his train at Nizhyn-Udinsk, about 300 miles west of Irkutsk. With him in a second train was the imperial Russian treasure, consisting first of gold bricks to the total value of 650 million rubles, about 65 million pounds, and secondly, about 500 million rubles worth of valuables and securities, the latter greatly depreciated. Kolchak had been deserted by nearly all his troops and followers, but a storm battalion of Czechs, animated by unfriendly feelings towards the admiral, remained as the safeguard of his life and treasure. News was received that a Bolshevik force was advancing from the north to capture the gold, and General Janin, a French officer in command of the Czechs, telegraphed to the storm battalion to retreat upon Irkutsk and leave Kolchak and the gold to their fate. On January 2, however, the admiral was informed through the Czechs that all echelons of the supreme ruler will be escorted to a safe zone, and if for any reason it is impossible to escort all echelons, in any case the admiral is to be safe and escorted to the Far East. In these circumstances, Kolchak, on January 4, telegraphed to Irkutsk that he surrendered his person to the Czechs. His private car, pasted with the flags of Japan, England, France, America, and Czechoslovakia, was attached to one of the trains conveying the storm battalion, and behind followed the train containing the gold. Although they passed through a territory said to be swarming with hostile insurgents, neither Czechs nor gold nor Kolchak were molested on their journey to Irkutsk. Here, on a railway siding, the admiral and the treasure halted. General Janin's first duty was the extrication of the Czechs, but he had also become responsible for the safety of Kolchak. Both of these tasks could have been easily discharged but for the gold. Everyone in the dissolving social structure of Siberia, Reds, Social Democrats, or banditti, wanted to see the backs of the Czechs and would have speeded their departure by every means. Kolchak could have accompanied them without difficulty, but the removal of the gold was a different matter. Russians of all colors were prepared to sink their political differences in order to prevent such an alarming occurrence. General Janin, on January 4, had accepted responsibility for the gold, and he wasted 10 days in parleying and haggling about it. Meanwhile, the Bolshevik forces were closing in on Irkutsk, and the local Social Democrat government flushed pinker daily. The situation became definitely menacing. The Red forces, spurred on by news of the gold, though poor in quality, were reaching large numbers. Such allied commissioners as had any troops of their nationality in tow in Siberia sent peremptory telegrams to General Janin that they would not help him out if he tarried any longer in Irkutsk. There is no reason to suppose that the Czechs, if they had been so disposed, were not strong enough to force their way out with both the admiral and the gold. But the atmosphere was loaded with panic and intrigue. General Janin on January 14 opened negotiations with the local Irkutsk government. An agreement was made that the Czechs should be assisted to depart and that the gold and the person of Admiral Kolchak should be left behind. One of the admiral's staff, Malinovsky, says in his diary, On January 14 at 6 p.m., 2 Czech officers stated that they had just received orders from Janín to hand over Kolchak and his staff to the local authorities. The admiral was always calm. Neither by word nor by gesture did he allow the Czechs to feel that he was afraid of death. With blazing eyes and a bitter smile, the admiral said, "So this is the meaning of the guarantee given me by Janín for an unhindered passage to the east, an international act of treachery. I am ready for anything." He was then incarcerated with his prime minister, Mr. Pepelayev, in the jail at Irkutsk. These proceedings staggered the High Commissioners further east in Harbin. They were not, however, in a strong position in view of their recent demands to Janín to retreat from Irkutsk. Their remonstrances now received offensive replies. General Janín said that the Czechs would have been attacked unless they had handed the admiral over, and that the action of the High Commissioners had never been the slightest help and had always made matters worse, and that he did not recognize their authority. "I consider myself," he said, "under obligation solely to the Czech government, which has ordered the return of its troops to Czechoslovakia, and to the Inter-Allied Council in Paris, which has ordered me to carry out this evacuation." And he is reported to have added, with equal insolence and truth, "I repeat that for His Majesty Nicholas II there was less ceremony." Every allowance must be made for the difficulties of this officer's position, and it may well be that a more detailed analysis would only reveal those difficulties more clearly. On January 21, the Social Democrat government of Irkutsk, already almost vermilion, declared itself Bolshevik. Soviet emissaries entered the town. Red Guards replaced the pink around Kolchak. On February 7, before it was light, the admiral and his prime minister were murdered in their cells in the customary Bolshevik manner by the discharging of automatic pistols pressed against the backs of their heads. There was no trial of any kind, but neither does it appear that they were tortured. The fate of the vast mass of gold and treasure is by no means free from mystery. Undoubtedly, the bulk fell into the hands of the Soviet government, but it is by no means clear that they got it all. 6 months later, the finance minister of General Wrangel's government began to make inconvenient inquiries about $1 million in gold reported to be deposited in a bank in San Francisco. He did not last long enough, however, to press this very far. It is a pity that the magnificent record of the Czechoslovak Army Corps should have been marred by the surrender of Kolchak. It seems that for a while these legionnaires forsook the stage of history on which they had hitherto acted and mingled with the ragged and demoralized Siberian audience. The military effort of Denikin was far more serious and sustained. In accordance with the advice of the General Staff, the main British assistance from June onwards was concentrated upon him. 250,000 rifles, 200 guns, 30 tanks and large masses of munitions and equipment were sent through the Dardanelles and the Black Sea to the port of Novorossiysk. And several hundred British officers and non-commissioned officers as advisors, instructors, storekeepers and even a few aviators furthered the organization of his armies. Denikin had as a nucleus the survivors of the heroic band who, a year before, under Alexeyev and Kornilov, had in the Russian volunteer army fought for the Russian cause, while it was still the cause of the Allies. He had therefore at any rate a sprinkling of competent, resolute and faithful officers. He had already, as we have seen, gained great successes, and as the summer wore on, his lines advanced rapidly northward till they stretched from the great city of Kiev to the west almost to the Caspian Sea. In his offensive lasting 5 months, between April and October 1919, Denikin took 250,000 prisoners, 700 guns, 1,700 machine guns, and 35 armored trains. And at the beginning of October he reached Tula, within 220 miles of Moscow, with forces approximately equal to those of his opponents, namely about 230,000 men. The general survey which I gave to the cabinet on September 22, 1919, while Kolchak was still in the field, stated, General Denikin has under the control of his troops regions which cannot contain less than 30 millions of European Russians, and which include the third, fourth, and fifth great cities of Russia. These regions are readily accessible to British and French trade, which is the main need of the population at the present time. They possess a network of railways, which are in comparatively good working order if rolling stock could be obtained. The inhabitants have been thoroughly sickened of Bolshevism, having either tried it of their own free will or experienced its oppression. There is no doubt whatever that the will of these 30 million people, if it could be expressed by plebiscite, would be overwhelmingly against being handed back again to the Bolshevik government of Lenin and Trotsky. Moreover, General Denikin disposes of an army which, although raised very largely on a voluntary basis, is rapidly growing and at the present time certainly amounts to over 300,000 fighting men. Our policy should continue to be to keep in friendly touch with Denikin, to complete the dispatch of the munitions, to help him in his difficulties with other anti-Bolshevik forces, to guide him as far as possible with political counsel, and to prevent him from falling into the hands of the reactionaries. Above all, it seems most important to develop trade and credit in the great regions which have been liberated, in order that the people there may contrast their conditions with the miseries prevailing in Bolshevik Russia. It is to be observed that General Denikin has never asked for men. One British lieutenant in the last 9 months has been slightly wounded in a tank. This is the sole British casualty of which we have information. No further large expenditure of money, other than the questionable value of surplus munitions, no assistance of troops, except a very limited establishment of technical personnel, are needed. Countenance, counsel, commerce, these are the means which are alone demanded. On his western flank, General Denikin is in contact with the rather feeble Ukrainian forces under Petlura. The question at issue between Denikin and Petlura is that of a united Russia versus an independent Ukraine. The Romanians, who feel that they can only take Bessarabia from a weak and defeated Russia, will naturally support Petlura. The duty of the Allies should be to try to reconcile the two conflicting points of view. Why should this be thought impossible? The conception of a Russia consisting of a number of autonomous states grouped together on a federal basis into a Russian Union is one within which all legitimate aspirations may be comprised. Such a Russian empire would be less of a menace to the future peace of the world than the vast centralized empire of Tsarism. And this is the moment when the critical situation of all the Russian parties and forces should make it possible, by a wise exercise of Allied policy, to give such a turn to events. A policy of the partition or dismemberment of Russia, although it might be for the moment successful, cannot have permanent results and could only open up an indefinite succession of wars, out of which, in the end, under Bolshevik or reactionary standards, a united militarist Russia would arise. Every effort should therefore be made to guide affairs into the channel which leads into a federalized Russia, without prejudice either to local autonomy or the principle of general unity. The downfall of Bela Kun amid universal execration, and the ease with which that downfall was accomplished, has been a most heavy blow to the prestige of the Bolshevik system of worldwide revolution. Its influence upon the general situation ought not to be underrated. Coming further north, on the left of the Ukrainian forces of Petlura, is the Polish battlefront. This has also continuously advanced in the last 4 or 5 months, involving the Bolsheviks in continual defeats at the hands of the Polish army and in heavy expenditure in men and munitions. The Polish front now stands in most places on Russian soil. The Poles are now inclined to suggest one of two courses to the Allies. A. That the Allies should finance a Polish army of 500,000 men, which should advance into the heart of Russia and capture Moscow, or B. That the Poles should make a peace with the Bolsheviks. Either of these courses at the present moment would be injurious. The advance of the hereditary enemy of Russia to Moscow would rouse whatever sense of nationalism is latent in those parts of Russia under the Bolshevik international regime. Moreover, the project is not one for which any of the Allied powers would be justified by their own public opinion in furnishing funds. On the other hand, if the Poles make a separate and precipitate peace with the Bolshevik army opposite the Polish front, which is the third strongest Bolshevik army now in the field, could swiftly be transferred to the attack of Denikin, and this might fundamentally jeopardize his continued existence. For us to encourage the Poles to make such a precipitate and isolated peace at this juncture, when everything is so critical, would utterly stultify a. the general policy of the Allies in promising support to Admiral Kolchak, and b. the special policy of Great Britain in sending great consignments of munitions to Denikin. We should be undoing with our left hand what we had done with our right, and by pursuing opposite and contradictory policies on different sectors of the common front, we should have done nothing more than prolong useless bloodshed and prevent the establishment of any form of settled authority. It seems therefore clear that our policy at the present moment should be to persuade the Poles to carry on for a few months as they are doing, that is, fighting and defeating the Bolsheviks on their borders where and when they can, without preparing either for a decisive advance into the heart of Russia or for a separate peace. In regard to the Baltic states, the policy here is similar to that which suggests itself in regard to Poland, that is, the taking of no violent action for which the Allies would have to make great sacrifices or become directly responsible, but, on the other hand, the fostering of the material and moral strength of such anti-Bolshevik forces as exist, and the coordination of their action so far as possible in order to prevent an untimely and inopportune collapse on this sector of the front. But Denikin's dangers grew with his conquests. He became responsible for a large part of Russia without any of the resources, moral, political, or material, needed to restore prosperity and contentment. The population, which welcomed his troops and dreaded the Bolsheviks, were too cowed by the terrible years through which they had passed to make any vigorous rally in his support. The responsibilities for the administrative well-being of great cities and provinces in a time of dearth and confusion, with crumbling railways and arrested commerce, fell upon a blunt, stout-hearted military man with a newly acquired taste for political affairs, who was already overburdened with the organization of his army and the conduct of the war. The political elements which had gathered around him were weak, mixed, and fiercely divided upon essentials. Some urged him to display the imperial standards and advance in the name of the Tsar. This alone would confront Bolshevism with insignia equally well understood on either side by all. The majority of his advisers and principal officers made it clear that they would not tolerate such a decision. Others urged him to proclaim that the land should be left to the peasants who had seized it, to whom it was replied, "Are we, then, no better than the Bolsheviks?" But the worst cleavage arose upon the policy towards the countries or provinces which had broken away from Russia. Denikin stood for the integrity of the Russian fatherland as he understood it. He was therefore the foe of his own allies in the war against the Soviets. The Baltic states, struggling for life against Bolshevik force and propaganda, could make no common cause with the Russian general who denied their right to independence. The Poles, who provided the largest and strongest army at war with the Soviets, saw that they would have to defend themselves against Denikin on the morrow of a joint victory. The Ukraine was ready to fight the Bolsheviks for independence, but was not attracted by the military government of Denikin. At every stage these antagonisms presented baffling problems. It was far beyond the power of Denikin to cope with them. But was it beyond the power of the victorious allies? Could not the statesmen who had assembled at Paris have pursued their task coherently? Could they not have said to Kolchak and Denikin, "Not another cartridge unless you make terms with the border states, recognizing their independence or autonomy as may be decided"? And having applied this superior compulsion to the Russian leaders, could they not have used their whole influence to combine the operations of all the states at war with Soviet Russia? And if not, would it not have been better at a much earlier stage to have left events to take their course? Surely the Inter-Allied Russian Committee, which I had proposed at Paris in February, was an instrument which it was imperative to call into being, if the declarations of the Big Five to Kolchak in May were ever to be made, or to be made good. But everything was partial, disjointed, half-hearted, inconsistent, and sometimes actually contradictory. I used what influence I had to prevent excesses and promote concerted action. September 18. It is of the very highest consequence that General Denikin should not only do everything in his power to prevent massacres of the Jews in the liberated districts, but should issue a proclamation against anti-Semitism. September 20. It is very important to bring about an improvement in the relations between the Ukraines and Denikin. It is necessary to avoid a situation which will oblige him to continue to employ troops against Petlura. A report from Moscow states that Green Guards are growing in numbers and organizing in many parts of the country, and that if they were not afraid of reprisals from the Whites, they might easily be made use of against the Bolsheviks. Is this point fully realized by Denikin? On October 9, I telegraphed to Denikin urging him to redouble efforts to restrain anti-Semitic feeling and to vindicate the honor of the volunteer army by such restraint. November 7. I have fostered development of a strong Russian and Anglo-Russian group, hoping thereby to develop trade and credit behind Denikin's front. The Russian anti-Bolshevik effort culminated in September. Kolchak was still forming a front in Siberia, and even made a small advance. Yudenich, with a northwest Russian force based on Reval, was actually at grips with Petrograd. Finland, fully mobilized, awaited only the slightest encouragement from the great powers to march also on that city. A flotilla of motorboats from the British blockading squadron in the Baltic broke into the harbor of Kronstadt, and by a feat of unsurpassed audacity and apparently on the sole initiative and authority of the Admiralty, sank 2 Russian battleships in the inner basin. The lines of Denikin embraced the whole of South Russia and were moving steadily northward. An arrangement between him and the Ukraine, combined with a steady pressure by Poland, might well have been decisive. But everything fell into pieces. Kolchak petered out. The Finns were chilled and discouraged by the Allies and stood idle. Yudenich, unsupported, failed. Poland remained inert. Denikin came to blows with Petlura, and his forces had just completely defeated this Ukrainian leader when his own distended front was pierced by Bolshevik counterattacks. The immense circle of weak, divided, hesitating and confused armies and states which lapped Soviet Russia was incapable of exerting a simultaneous pressure. During November, Denikin's armies melted away. and his whole front disappeared with the swiftness of pantomime. I cannot describe these disasters and their cause better than in a memorandum which I wrote on September 15. Large sums of money and considerable forces have been employed by the Allies against the Bolsheviks during the year. Britain has contributed the nominal value of nearly 100 millions, France between 30 and 40 millions, the United States have maintained, and are still maintaining, over 8,000 troops in Siberia. Japan has an army of between 30 and 40,000 strong in eastern Siberia, which she is now in process of reinforcing. Admiral Kolchak's armies, equipped mainly with British munitions, reached in May a total of nearly 300,000 men. General Denikin's armies aggregate at the present time about 250,000 combatants. Besides these, there were the Finns, who could place 100,000 men in the field. There were also the Estonians, the Lats and the Lithuanians, completely maintaining their front from the Baltic to Poland. Lastly, there are the powerful Polish forces, and help could also have been obtained from Romania and to a lesser extent from Serbia and Czechoslovakia. It is obvious from the above that the elements existed which, used in combination, would easily have been successful. They have, however, been dissipated by a total lack of combination, and this has been due to a complete absence of any definite or decided policy among the victorious Allies. Some were in favor of peace and some were in favor of war. In the result, they made neither peace nor war. If they made war on one part of the front, they hastened to make peace on another. If they encouraged Kolchak and Denikin and spent both money and men in their support, they gave no encouragement to Finland, to the Baltic states, or to Poland. Every proposal to establish a unified system of command and direction of the resistance to the Bolsheviks has been vetoed. In June, Kolchak was promised, on the word of the 5 plenipotentiaries, continuance of their support in supplies. Since that date, the withdrawal of all support from him has been continuous. Finland, at 2 periods of this year, was ready to march, in conjunction with the army of Yudenich and the Estonians, and occupy Petrograd. Not the slightest countenance or encouragement was given her in such an enterprise. Poland was prepared to maintain strong pressure against the Bolsheviks. She was actually discouraged. As for the small states, they were told that they could make peace or not, as they liked, and that in any case they would get no help. All these steps were perfectly compatible with a policy of peace or a policy of strict neutrality. They were certainly not compatible with a policy of war, such as was actually being carried out on other sectors of the immense circle around Bolshevik Russia. Meanwhile, the Bolsheviks succeeded in gradually developing their armies. These armies were far weaker than the forces potentially opposed to them. But as they lay in the center of the circle and could, subject to the limits of their transportation, throw their weight from one part of its circumference to the other, they have been able to attack in detail and, in many cases, to overwhelm the forces opposed to them. Thus, while Denikin was getting on his feet, Kolchak was broken and defeated. During the last 5 months, Denikin's power has been steadily growing and great successes have been gained by his armies. But the weight against them has steadily accumulated owing to the defeat of Kolchak and the practical cessation of any serious pressure along the whole Western or European front. During the last 3 months, the very large numbers of men which the Bolsheviks were able to transfer from in front of Kolchak, from in front of the Poles, and from in front of the Baltic states, and the fact that they were able to throw practically the whole of their reserves on the southern or Denikin front, have given them a large superiority of numbers over Denikin. His army, which is still the best army, spread out in practically a single line on a front of more than 1,200 miles, has now been thrown back everywhere by these superior forces. Although there are still battles to be fought, and the resisting power of his army is still very considerable, he may be overwhelmed and broken up as an effective military factor. The declarations which have been made in public of the withdrawal of support, the lack of any moral support or vigorous concerted action, and the feeling of being abandoned by the great Allied powers may easily produce conditions in his army which will lead to its complete destruction or disappearance. The destruction of Kolchak's army and government is practically complete, and the whole vast region of Siberia up to Lake Baikal, east of which the Japanese have taken effectual charge, will be submerged either by the Bolshevik armies or sheer anarchy. Turkestan and the provinces of Central Asia are overrun by the Bolsheviks, who already menace Persia and are intriguing with Afghanistan. Whereas concerted efforts could quite easily have sustained Kolchak, carried Denikin to success and enabled Petrograd to be captured by Yudenich with the Estonians and the Finns, the Bolsheviks are now within measurable distance of complete military triumph on all fronts where they are active. It is with the situation arising out of these facts that we are now confronted. The inactivity of the Poles has enabled the Bolsheviks to concentrate against Denikin. The destruction of Denikin will enable them, if they choose, to concentrate against the Poles. The growth of Denikin's forces and the efforts of his armies took the pressure off the Baltic states and enabled Finland to remain inert. What is now happening to Denikin has already produced a significant change in the Baltic area. The Bolshevik negotiators have entirely altered their tone towards the small states, as they are quite justified in doing in consequence of the changed military situation. The alarm of the Estonians, the Latvians and the Lithuanians is already apparent and will become increasingly apparent as Denikin's fortunes and strength subside. Finland is now reported by the latest telegrams to be mobilizing 100,000 men as a defensive measure. Half that number 2 months ago would have sufficed, in conjunction with Yudenich's effort, to have taken Petrograd. The collapse of Denikin will give the Bolsheviks the command of the Caspian and place them in close and effective relation with the Turkish nationalists under Enver and Mustafa Kemal and others. The pressure on Persia and the danger in Afghanistan will, in that event, immediately assume a most direct and formidable character. We are told that it is idle to speculate about the future or to indulge in prophecy, but surely certain well-marked and not distant contingencies which will follow upon the destruction of Denikin do require to be thought over in advance. Hitherto it has been a cheap thing to mock at Denikin's efforts and to indulge to the full the easy wisdom of pessimism and indifference. Hitherto the Allies have been fighting Bolshevism mainly with Russian armies. What will happen when these Russian armies are gone? Zinoviev is reported in the latest wireless to have used a most significant expression which reveals clearly the effect upon the minds of the Bolshevik leaders of which they have been made a present. The peace, he is reported to have said, which Russia must obtain would not be a socialist peace but a bourgeois peace. The demands which the Bolsheviks are now to make on Estonia, the menace which Finland already recognizes, and the situation in Central Asia and towards the frontiers of India are the first illustrations of what is meant by this. Whereas by taking the proper concerted measures we could, without any large additional employment of men or money, have established an anti-Bolshevik and modernized Russia friendly to the intent, we are now within measurable distance of a Bolshevik Russia thoroughly militarized, with nothing but its militarism to live on, bitterly hostile to the intent, ready to work with Germany and already largely organized by Germany. The idea that Poland will serve as a barrier to such dangers is illusory. The idea that by standing on the defensive on the east until every other anti-Bolshevik force has been destroyed, she will be able to maintain a strong attitude towards Germany in the west, is equally ill-founded. What is the wisdom of a policy which seeks to strengthen Poland by Allied money and munitions and yet calmly acquiesces in the destruction of Denikin and the consequent liberation of the main Bolshevik armies to treble and quadruple the enemies with whom Poland has to contend? What is the justice or logic of recognizing every state and even to a large extent guaranteeing the independence and security of every state which has torn itself away from the Russian Empire, while refusing to recognize and aid in preserving the great territories and populations in the south of Russia from which General Denikin's armies are drawn and which are unquestionably anti-Bolshevik? It is a delusion to suppose that all this year we have been fighting the battles of the anti-Bolshevik Russians. On the contrary, they have been fighting ours, and this truth will become painfully apparent from the moment that they are exterminated and the Bolshevik armies are supreme over the whole vast territories of the Russian Empire. As Denikin's failure became pronounced, the fitful countenance which the great powers had given him was swiftly withdrawn. On February 3, 1920, it became my duty to instruct General Hallman to put the facts plainly before the Russian leader. I cannot hold out any expectation that the British government will give any further aid beyond what has been already promised in the final packet. Neither will they use their influence to make an aggressive combination between the Poles, the Baltic states, Finland, etc., with Denikin against Soviet Russia. Their reason is that they do not possess the resources in men or money sufficient to carry any such enterprise to success, and they do not wish to encourage others without having the power to sustain them. The British government, in general agreement with the French government, are disposed to offer to the border states a measure of support in case they are attacked by the Soviet government. It is no good arguing whether this is a wise or a right policy. It is what I believe is going to happen. It is said the border states are only fighting for their independence, while Denikin is fighting for the control of Russia. We cannot undertake to make further exertions in support of this last objective, although we sympathize with it. The question which must now be faced is how to save as much as possible from the wreck. I now pinned my hopes to finding some asylum, however temporary, for the mass of refugees who fled southward from Red vengeance. The Cossack territories of the Don and the Kuban, where the whole population was passionately anti-Bolshevik, might perhaps be constituted an independent or autonomous region. Failing this, there was the Crimea. Into this fertile peninsula the broken fragments of Denikin's armies and several 100,000 civilian fugitives were soon crowded in every circumstances of misery and want. Their defense was maintained for a few more months after Denikin's supersession by General Wrangel, a new figure of unusual energy and quality, who thus too late reached the first place in White Russian councils. Some moral assistance, in the form of gunfire, was given by the British fleet, officially engaged in rescue work in preventing the Bolsheviks from invading the Crimea by sea. But in July the marsh defenses dried up and the land defenses broke down. The Crimea was overrun, and a hideous flight of refugees to Constantinople ensued. There were not enough ships for half of the panic-stricken multitudes. The savage enemy bore down exultingly their last despairing defenders. Smallpox and typhus epidemics made new alliances with sword and famine. Shiploads of destitute and infected persons, sometimes all dead or moribund, arrived continuously in the already overcrowded, impoverished, and straitened Turkish capital. A veil has been drawn over the horrors of this final phase. The British troops and sailors and some British and American philanthropic agencies in Constantinople gave almost all they possessed in local aid. But the Allied and associated powers averted their gaze and stopped their ears. They did not wish to know too much, and, like Napoleon at the Beresina, could only reply, "Do you want to take away my calm?" After all, death is merciful. It was certainly busy. Such were the solutions which the victors in the Great War were able to afford to Russian affairs.